How to move people, change minds, and get what you want without manipulation. Real persuasion, the kind that doesn't feel like a trick, doesn't leave the other person feeling cheated, and doesn't require you to lie, pressure, or manipulate anyone into anything. And before you say it, I know, the word persuasion has a bad reputation. When most people hear it, they think of a used car salesman and a cheap suit. They think of manipulation. They think of someone sweet-talking their way into getting what they want, while the other person gets the short end of the deal. And I get why it feels that way, because most of what gets taught under the label of persuasion is exactly that. It's cheap tactics, it's pressure, it's the kind of thing you can smell from across the room. But here's the thing, that's not persuasion. That's coercion dressed up in a nice tie. And real persuasion, the deep, effective, lasting kind, is the exact opposite of that. Real persuasion is one of the most profoundly human skills that exists. It's the ability to understand another person so deeply, their fears, their values, their desires, their hesitations, that you can speak directly to what already matters to them. It's not about changing who someone is, it's about connecting what you need with what they already care about. And when you do that well, nobody feels pushed, nobody feels tricked, they feel understood. And that is the foundation of every great relationship, every successful negotiation, every movement that ever changed the world. Think about the people in your life who are genuinely persuasive. Not the loud ones, not the ones who steamroll conversations or pressure people into corners, the ones who are actually persuasive. The friend everyone wants to talk to before making a big decision. The colleague who can get buy-in from any room they walk into. The person who can diffuse an argument in 60 seconds flat. What do they have in common? They're not louder, they're not more aggressive, they're just better at understanding people. And that skill, the skill of understanding and connecting, is learnable. It's not a personality trait you're born with, it's a practice. So that's what today is about. We're going to go deep. We're going to cover the psychology behind why people say yes. We're going to talk about the invisible forces that drive every human decision. We're going to walk through the specific tools that the most persuasive communicators in the world use. And more importantly, we're going to talk about the mindset that makes all of those tools actually work. Because here's what nobody tells you. The tools are the easy part. The mindset is everything. And if you try to use the tools without the mindset, people will feel it. They'll feel that something is off. They'll feel like they're being played, even if they can't quite articulate why. But when you have the mindset right, the tools become almost unnecessary. People just want to work with you. They just want to say yes to you, because you've made them feel something that most people are desperately hungry for. You've made them feel truly heard. Let's get into it. Why most people can't persuade anyone. Let me start with a story. Two people walk into a meeting to pitch the same idea to the same boss. The first person comes in with a 40-slide deck. They've been working on it for 2 weeks. It's detailed, thorough, methodical. They walk through every slide. They have the data, they have the projections, they have an answer for every possible objection. They've done everything right, technically speaking. And when they finish, the boss says, "Let me think about it," which, as we all know, usually means no. The second person walks in with 5 slides. They start by asking their boss a question. What's the thing keeping you up at night right now when it comes to this project? The boss talks for 10 minutes. The second person listens, really listens.
And then, when they present their idea, they frame every single element of it around what the boss just said. Not around what they thought the boss cared about, around what the boss literally just told them they cared about. The boss approves it by the end of the meeting. Same idea, same boss, completely different outcome. Why? Because the first person was presenting, the second person was persuading, and the difference between those two things is enormous. Presenting is about transferring information. You have something to say, and you say it. You've prepared your message, and you deliver it. That's it. And there's nothing wrong with presenting, but presenting alone will almost never move someone to action. Because human beings, all of us, are not primarily rational creatures. We like to think we are. We like to believe that if you give us good enough information, clear enough logic, compelling enough data, we'll make the rational decision. But that's not how we actually work. That is not how decisions get made. Here's the uncomfortable reality that changes everything. People decide with their emotions and then justify with their logic, not the other way around. The decision comes first, and the reasoning comes after, every single time. This isn't some cynical observation about human weakness. It's neuroscience. It's how our brains are actually wired. The emotional centers of our brain process information and generate a response before the rational centers even get involved. We feel something about an idea before we think about it. And once we've felt something, our rational mind's job isn't to evaluate objectively. It's to build a case for the conclusion our gut already reached. Which means that if you want to persuade someone, the very first thing you need to do is not make a better argument. The first thing you need to do is understand how this specific person is feeling right now, in this moment, about this specific topic. Because until you address the emotional reality of the situation, no amount of logic will land. It will slide right off them like water off a raincoat.
This is why most people fail at persuasion. They try to out-argue instead of out-empathize. They think the key to getting someone to change their mind is to have a better point, and so they double down on their logic. They gather more data, they make more slides, they construct more elaborate arguments. And all of this, paradoxically, makes the other person dig in harder. Because what the other person is experiencing isn't a logic problem, it's an emotional experience. And you're responding to their emotional experience with more data, which signals to them, subconsciously, that you don't actually understand them. And when people feel misunderstood, they don't open up, they close down. There's another massive mistake that kills persuasion before it even starts: trying to persuade too early. We jump to our ask before we've built enough trust, before we've established enough shared context, before we've done the work of genuinely understanding what the other person actually wants. We're so focused on our own goal, getting the sale, winning the argument, getting the yes, that we broadcast that agenda loud and clear from the moment we open our mouths, and the person on the other side picks up on it immediately. They feel the agenda, and the moment they feel your agenda, their defenses go up, not because they're being difficult, but because it's a survival instinct. When someone is trying to get something from you, you protect yourself. So the first rule of persuasion, the foundational one, the one everything else is built on, is this: stop trying to persuade people. Paradoxical as it sounds, the moment you're visibly trying to persuade someone, you've already lost a significant portion of your influence. The best persuaders in the world don't look like they're persuading. They look like they're helping. They look like they're curious. They look like they're genuinely trying to understand. And in doing that, they create the conditions in which the other person persuades themselves. Because that's the real secret. The most effective persuasion isn't something you do to a person, it's something you do with them.
You create the environment in which they feel safe enough, understood enough, and respected enough to arrive at the conclusion you want them to arrive at, on their own terms, in their own words. That's not manipulation. That's mastery.
The psychology of yes, what actually drives human decisions. If you want to persuade people more effectively, you need to understand why people say yes in the first place. Not why they should say yes, why they actually do. And that requires us to go a level deeper than logic. It requires us to understand the emotional and psychological drivers that sit beneath every decision a human being makes. Let's start with the most fundamental one. People do things for their reasons, not yours. This seems obvious when you say it out loud. Of course, people act on their own motivations. But watch how most people try to persuade someone. They explain why it's a good idea from their perspective. They list the benefits that matter to them. They make the case that would have convinced them, and they wonder why it doesn't work. Every person walking around on this planet has a set of deeply held values, fears, desires, and beliefs that drive their behavior. Some of these are conscious, many are not. And the key to persuasion is not to override those drivers, it's to align with them, to find the place where what you're asking for connects to something they already want or already care about. When you find that connection point, the resistance evaporates, because now you're not asking them to do something for you, you're offering them a path to something they already wanted. Let's talk about some of the core psychological drivers that show up in almost every persuasion situation. The first one is the need for autonomy. Human beings have an extraordinarily deep need to feel like they're in control of their own choices. When people feel like they're being told what to do or pushed into something, or that there's no alternative, they resist. Even if what you're proposing is objectively good for them, even if they would have agreed if they'd come to the idea themselves. The feeling of being controlled triggers a psychological reactance, a reflexive desire to do the opposite just to reassert their agency. This is why so many well-intentioned persuasion attempts backfire. The more you push, the more they pull. The more you insist, the more they resist. And the more options you eliminate, the more trapped they feel, and the harder they fight to get out. The most effective persuaders understand this and work with it rather than against it. They give people choices. They frame things in terms of what the person gets to decide. They use language that emphasizes freedom rather than obligation. Here are a couple of ways we could approach this. What feels right to you is infinitely more effective than here's what we should do. Same destination, completely different experience of getting there. The second driver is the need to feel understood. This one might actually be the most powerful of all. There's a hunger in almost every human being to feel genuinely seen and understood by another person. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to communicate who we are, what we think, what we feel, what we need, and in most of our interactions, we feel partially heard at best. People respond to the surface of what we said, not to the deeper thing we were trying to express. And that gap between what we said and what we meant leaves us feeling slightly alone even in the middle of a conversation. When someone actually closes that gap, when they hear not just your words, but the thing beneath your words, when they reflect back the feeling behind the statement, when they demonstrate through their response that they truly got what you were trying to say, something in us opens up. We relax, we trust them, we become willing to be influenced by them. Because someone who truly understands you couldn't possibly be trying to harm you, and so when they offer a suggestion or make a request, it doesn't feel threatening, it feels safe. This is the neurological basis of rapport.
Rapport isn't just about being likable, it's about creating the felt sense of mutual understanding, the experience of being on the same side. And when you have genuine rapport with someone, your persuasion efficiency multiplies. Not because you're doing anything manipulative, but because the defensive walls are down and the person is genuinely open to your perspective.
The third driver is identity. People make decisions that are consistent with how they see themselves or how they want to see themselves. This is one of the most powerful and underused levers in all of persuasion. When you can frame a request as consistent with someone's identity, their compliance rate goes through the roof. When you frame it as inconsistent, even if it's logically beneficial, they'll resist. Think about it. If someone sees themselves as a generous person, they're far more likely to say yes to a charitable request when you say, "You've always struck me as someone who genuinely cares about this kind of thing." You're not lying, you're not flattering, you're connecting the request to who they believe themselves to be. And because saying yes now reinforces that identity, and saying no would threaten it, the path of least psychological resistance is yes. People will also act to maintain consistency with commitments they've already made. Once someone has said something out loud, once they've publicly committed to a value or a position, they will work extraordinarily hard to remain consistent with that statement. This is called commitment and consistency, and it's one of the most reliable psychological forces in human behavior. If you can get someone to articulate their own values or priorities before you make your ask, and then frame your ask as consistent with those values, you've dramatically increased the likelihood of a yes. The fourth driver is social proof. We are deeply social creatures. One of the primary ways we figure out what to do in ambiguous situations is to look at what other people like us are doing. This isn't weakness, it's efficiency. We can't evaluate every possible decision from first principles every time, so we use the behavior of others as data. If lots of people who seem similar to us are doing something, it's probably a reasonable thing to do. The most effective persuaders know how to deploy social proof not as manipulation, but as genuine context. Most of the managers in your position have found that this approach saves them about 5 hours a week, is providing relevant information. You're giving the person data about what people in their situation have experienced, and that data is genuinely useful to them in making their decision. The key is that it has to be true, and it has to be relevant. Social proof that doesn't match the person's situation is transparent and falls flat. But social proof that's accurate and well-targeted is one of the fastest ways to reduce hesitation. The fifth driver, and perhaps the most fundamental of all, is emotion. Specifically, the emotions of safety, desire, and fear. Every significant human decision is driven by one of three things: the desire to move toward something that feels good, the desire to move away from something that feels bad, or the desire to feel safe and protected. And the most effective persuasion speaks directly to one or more of these three emotional motivations. Now, before you think I'm about to tell you to exploit people's fears, I'm not. There's a difference between acknowledging the real risks of a situation and fear-mongering. There's a difference between helping someone see the genuine cost of inaction and manipulating them through manufactured anxiety. The first is honest and respectful. The second is cheap and ultimately self-defeating, because people remember when they've been fear-mongered and they don't trust that source again. The key is to be honest about all three emotional drivers. Help people see what's genuinely desirable about what you're proposing,
Help them understand the real cost of not doing it, and give them the sense that working with you is the safe and reliable path. All of this can be done with complete honesty. In fact, it has to be done honestly to be sustainable.
The foundation: trust, credibility, and genuine connection. Before we talk about any specific persuasion techniques, I want to spend some real time on what actually makes persuasion possible in the first place. Because there's a layer beneath all the tactics, beneath all the frameworks, beneath everything. And if that layer isn't there, none of the rest of it matters. That layer is trust. People are persuaded by people they trust, full stop. And people trust people who they believe have their genuine interests at heart, not their own interests, yours. That shift from being someone who is trying to get something from a person to being someone who genuinely cares about serving them is the most powerful transformation you can make in your ability to influence others. I want to be really honest here, because this is a place where a lot of people try to shortcut. They try to act like they care without actually caring. They try to fake genuine interest. They try to simulate empathy. And this almost always fails, not because people are all that great at consciously detecting inauthenticity, but because when you're performing care rather than feeling it, your behavior becomes subtly inconsistent. You listen attentively when it serves you and check your phone when it doesn't. You ask about their needs when you're pitching and forget about them when you're closing. You project warmth in the meeting and forget to follow up. And people notice these inconsistencies, maybe not consciously, but at a gut level they stop trusting you because your behavior patterns don't add up. Genuine trust, on the other hand, is built by consistent behavior over time. Every time you do what you said you'd do. Every time you tell someone an uncomfortable truth rather than a comfortable lie. Every time you prioritize their outcome over your commission. Every time you refer them elsewhere because it's genuinely the right thing for them. These acts of consistent integrity accumulate, slowly at first, and then, at some point, you stop having to persuade people at all, because your reputation precedes you. When people already trust you deeply, they're not evaluating your pitch. They're just deciding what they want from the person they already trust. The most effective long-term strategy in persuasion is not to get better at convincing people. It's to build the kind of reputation and track record that makes convincing necessary. But trust isn't just about integrity over time. It's also about how you make people feel in the immediate moment. And the fastest way to build immediate trust is through a specific kind of listening. Not passive listening, not waiting for your turn listening, but genuinely curious, fully present, make the other person feel like the most interesting person in the room listening. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine you're at a dinner party. You're seated next to two different people over the course of the evening. The first person is entertaining. They're witty. They tell great stories. They're clearly smart and successful. But throughout the whole conversation, you notice that when you speak, they're sort of waiting. They're listening, but there's something behind their eyes that's already preparing their next point. They respond to the surface of what you said, but they don't really follow up. They don't go deeper into your answer. The conversation stays on the surface. The second person asks you a question and then actually listens to your answer, and then asks a follow-up question about something specific you said. Not a prepared question, a genuine question, one that could only have come from actually hearing what you said, and then another. And by the end of the meal, you realize that this person has asked you more questions than you've asked them.
They haven't told you a single impressive story about themselves, and yet for some reason you feel incredibly warm toward them. You feel like they really get you. You think to yourself, I like this person. And if they called you the next day and asked you for a favor, you would absolutely say yes.
That second person just demonstrated the most powerful influence tool that exists: deep, genuine, curious listening. Not as a tactic, as a sincere interest in other people. And the reason it works is because it gives people something they are starving for in their daily lives. Most of us go through our days feeling slightly invisible, slightly misunderstood, doing our best to be seen, and only partially succeeding. When someone actually sees you, fully sees you, in a conversation for 15 minutes, it creates a connection that is disproportionately powerful relative to the time it took. Now, what's the practical takeaway from this? It's that your questions are more powerful than your statements. In almost any persuasion situation, the person who asks the best questions ends up with more influence than the person who makes the best arguments, because questions do several things simultaneously. They gather information that makes your eventual pitch more targeted and relevant. They make the other person feel heard. They surface the other person's own reasoning, which you can then reflect back to them. And they create a conversational dynamic in which the other person is doing the talking, which means they are the one generating the arguments and the enthusiasm. And people believe what they say more than what they're told. Credibility is the second component of the trust foundation. Even if someone trusts your intentions, they also need to trust your competence. They need to believe that you know what you're talking about, that you have genuine expertise, and that your recommendation is based on real knowledge and experience rather than enthusiasm alone. Credibility comes from several sources. The most obvious one is genuine expertise, actually knowing a lot about the domain you're operating in. But there's a subtler and often more effective kind of credibility that comes from intellectual honesty, specifically from acknowledging the limitations or downsides of your own position. When you say, look, this approach has real drawbacks and here's what they are, you immediately become more believable on everything else you say, because you've demonstrated that you're not just selling, you're informing. And that's a completely different posture that generates a completely different response. Most people avoid acknowledging weaknesses in their position because they're afraid it will undermine their case. The opposite is true. When you proactively name the potential objections before the other person does, two things happen. First, the objection loses its power because you've already neutralized it. Second, your credibility spikes because you've demonstrated that you're not trying to hide anything. You're confident enough in the overall case to name its flaws and still stand behind it. The architecture of an influential conversation. All right, now that we have the foundation, the mindset, the trust, the understanding of psychological drivers, let's talk about the actual structure of a persuasive conversation. Because even with the right mindset, there's a craft to this. There's an architecture, and understanding that architecture will help you be more consistently effective. The structure has 5 phases, and they have to happen in order. Trying to skip any phase is like trying to build the second floor of a house before you've finished the first. It can't hold. Phase 1 is connection. Before any business is discussed, before any ask is made, before any agenda is even hinted at, you establish connection. You make the other person feel comfortable in your presence. You demonstrate genuine interest in them as a human being. You do this through small things, remembering something they mentioned before, asking a thoughtful question about their world, sharing something real about yours. This doesn't have to take long, but it cannot be skipped, because without connection, everything that follows feels transactional.
and transactional conversations generate transactional results at best. Phase 2 is discovery. This is the most underrated phase of persuasion. It's where you ask questions, lots of them. Your goal is to deeply understand three things: what the person wants, what they fear, and what they believe is standing between them and what they want. These questions need to be genuine. They cannot feel like an interrogation. They're curious, open-ended explorations. What does success look like to you on this? What's your biggest concern about moving forward? What's worked well for you in the past on something like this? What would have to be true for you to feel confident about this? These questions are doing enormous amounts of work. They're gathering the raw material for your eventual pitch. They're making the person feel heard and understood, and they're often helping the person clarify their own thinking, which creates a sense of forward momentum even before you've said anything persuasive. Phase 3 is alignment. This is where you demonstrate, not tell, demonstrate that you understood what they said. You reflect back the key elements of what they shared. You connect their stated priorities to the framework you're about to propose. Based on what you said, it sounds like the most important thing to you is X, and you're worried about Y. Is that right? This simple act of checking your understanding does something profound. It makes the person feel genuinely heard, possibly for the first time in a long time, and it shows them that what's coming next was designed for them, not for a generic version of their situation. This is the phase where most amateur persuaders fail completely. They treat the discovery phase as a formality, a few obligatory questions before they get to the real thing, which is their pitch. And then the pitch sounds like every other pitch because it hasn't been shaped by anything specific about this particular person. The person feels it. They feel the genericness of it, and they disengage.
But when you do genuine discovery and then demonstrate that you heard what you heard, the emotional response is completely different. The person leans in. They think, this person gets me. And now your pitch has an audience that's genuinely ready to receive it. Phase 4 is the offer. This is where you actually propose your idea, product, recommendation, or request. But notice how different it lands now compared to leading with it. You've built connection, you've done genuine discovery, you've demonstrated understanding, and now instead of pitching your thing, you're showing how your thing solves the specific problems this specific person just told you they have. Every feature, every benefit, every element of your proposal is framed in terms of what they said matters to them. The language of this phase is crucial. Compare these two framings. Our software has a built-in analytics dashboard versus you mentioned that one of your biggest frustrations is not being able to see in real time what's working. This dashboard lets you see exactly that, live at any moment. Same feature, completely different impact. The first is a feature. The second is a solution to a problem they told you they had. Phase 5 is facilitation. This is where most people think closing happens, and they're not entirely wrong, but the word closing implies something being done to the other person, which is exactly the wrong frame. Facilitation is about helping the other person take the next step. And the biggest tool in this phase is reducing friction, not increasing pressure. What's stopping them from saying yes right now? Is it information they don't have? Provide it. Is it a risk they're not comfortable with? Address it honestly. Is it a logistical concern about implementation? Walk through it with them. Is it that they need to check with someone else? Offer to be part of that conversation. The goal is not to overcome their resistance. It's to understand what's creating it and address it so genuinely that the resistance dissolves on its own. And sometimes, often actually, the most persuasive thing you can do in Phase 5 is to simply ask one question.
What would need to be true for you to feel confident moving forward? Let them answer, and then address that directly and honestly without blinking.
The language of influence. Words that open and words that close. Language is the medium through which persuasion operates, and the specific words you choose matter enormously, not just in terms of content, but in terms of the emotional and psychological experience they create in the listener. Let me walk you through some of the most important linguistic distinctions that separate effective from ineffective persuaders. The first one is the difference between but and and. This is a small thing that has a large effect. When you disagree with someone and say, "I understand what you're saying, but," everything before the but gets erased in the listener's mind. But functions as a negation. It signals that everything that came before it was just a formality, and now comes the real message. People brace for it. Their defenses go up. Replace but with and something remarkable happens. I understand what you're saying, and I also think. The and preserves both perspectives. It doesn't erase the first thing. It adds to it. It signals that you're not fighting their view, you're building on it. The listener's nervous system response is completely different. They stay open rather than closing down. The second distinction is between "you need to" and "what if you." Telling someone what they need to do activates their autonomy threat response. Even if you're right, even if it's genuinely in their best interest, the moment you tell someone what they need to do, part of them wants to do the opposite, just to maintain their sense of self-determination. You need to start exercising more. Most people's gut response to that sentence is mild resentment, regardless of whether they know it's true. What if you tried X for 2 weeks feels completely different? It's exploratory, not prescriptive. It invites rather than commands. And it preserves the person's sense of agency, because trying something for 2 weeks is their choice, not a directive they're complying with. Same content, radically different emotional reception. Third distinction, framing losses versus framing gains. Behavioral economics has demonstrated conclusively that people are far more motivated by the prospect of avoiding a loss than by the prospect of gaining an equivalent benefit. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good. This isn't irrational, it's just how our brains are calibrated. Effective persuaders understand this and use it honestly. If we don't address this, "here's what it will cost you over the next year," is more motivating than "here's what you'll gain." Both can be true, both should be communicated, but the loss framing will often carry more emotional weight. The key, again, is honesty. You can't manufacture a fear that isn't real, but you can make sure that the real costs of inaction are clearly visible and felt, not just abstractly acknowledged. The fourth linguistic principle is the power of narrative. Human beings are wired for stories. We process information presented as narrative differently from information presented as data or argument. Stories bypass the critical mind. They engage the experiential mind. When you hear a story, you don't evaluate it, you inhabit it. And if the story resonates with your own experience or your own desires, it creates a kind of felt certainty that no amount of data can replicate. The most persuasive communicators in the world are master storytellers. They don't lead with abstractions, they lead with specifics. They don't say, "Our clients have had great results." They say, "Let me tell you about someone who was exactly where you were 6 months ago."
And they tell a real, specific, vivid story about a real person who faced the same challenges, made the same decision the listener is being asked to make, and got a specific, concrete result. Stories work because they reduce psychological distance. Abstract claims about outcomes feel uncertain. Stories make things concrete and real. When you can see yourself in someone else's story, the decision you're being asked to make feels less like a leap into the unknown and more like a well-lit path that others have walked successfully.
The fifth principle is the use of questions as statements. One of the most sophisticated persuasion techniques, done well, is making your most important points not as assertions, but as questions. Wouldn't it make more sense to address this now before it gets more expensive to fix? Says the same thing as you should address this now, but the question version invites the listener to arrive at the conclusion themselves. And a conclusion a person reaches themselves is always more convincing and more durable than one they were told. This is called the Socratic method, and it's been understood as a tool of influence for about 2,500 years. Socrates never told anyone anything. He asked questions, and through the questions, he led people to examine their own assumptions and often to change their minds entirely without ever feeling like they'd been talked into anything. They felt like they'd figured something out. The sixth principle is the use of silence. This is the most underused tool in persuasion. Most people are deeply uncomfortable with silence. The moment there's a lull in conversation, they rush to fill it. And in doing so, they often undermine themselves. After you make a strong point, after you ask a powerful question, after you present a compelling offer, stop talking. Let the silence do its work. The other person will fill it, and what they say in that silence is almost always more useful than anything you could have added. In negotiation specifically, silence is one of the most powerful tools available. When someone makes an offer or states a position, simply looking at them thoughtfully and staying quiet creates enormous psychological pressure on them to say more, to elaborate, to negotiate against themselves. Not because you've done anything manipulative, but because silence feels incomplete to most people, and they'll instinctively try to complete it.
Handling resistance, the art of turning no into information. Here's something that most people who want to get better at persuasion have completely backwards. They think that resistance is the enemy, that when someone pushes back, says no, raises objections, or digs in, it's a sign that the persuasion has failed. But resistance isn't the enemy. Resistance is information, and if you know how to listen to it, it's actually one of the most valuable things that can happen in a persuasion conversation. Think about what a no actually means. In most cases, a no is not a final verdict. It's not a statement about the fundamental merits of your case. It's a signal that one or more of the following is true. The person doesn't fully understand what you're proposing. The timing doesn't feel right. They don't have enough information to feel confident. The ask is too large for the current level of trust. They have a concern that hasn't been addressed, or they're not the right person to be making this decision. None of those things is fatal. All of them are workable, but only if you stay curious instead of getting defensive. The first rule of handling resistance is to welcome it, not performatively, genuinely. When someone pushes back, your response should not be to push harder. It should be to get more curious. "Tell me more about that" is one of the most powerful sentences in persuasion. It signals that you're not threatened by their pushback. It signals that you want to understand, and it often surfaces the real concern, which is almost never the stated concern. Because here's a pattern you'll see over and over once you start paying attention. People rarely tell you their real objection first. The first objection is usually a placeholder. It's a safe thing to say while the person figures out what they actually think and feel. It's too expensive might mean, I'm not sure this is the priority right now. I need to think about it might mean, I'm not sure I trust this enough yet. It's not the right time might mean, I don't feel confident that this will work for me specifically. If you respond to the stated objection at face value, if you immediately start justifying the price when the real issue is trust, you're having a conversation about a problem that isn't the problem. And no matter how brilliantly you solve the stated problem, the real problem remains, and the person still says no, or worse, they say, "Let me think about it," and disappear. The technique for getting to the real objection is simple, but requires some courage. When someone raises an objection, you acknowledge it, you validate it, and then you ask, beyond that, is there anything else that's giving you pause? You keep asking versions of this question until you've surfaced everything on the table. And only then do you start addressing the objections in reverse order, starting with the last one surfaced, which is usually the most fundamental. The second principle of handling resistance is to agree before you redirect. This is counterintuitive but extremely effective. When someone pushes back, don't fight them. Find the part of what they said that's genuinely true and start there. You're absolutely right that this is a significant investment, is a better response to a price objection than, but let me explain the value. The first response takes something off the table, the argument about whether it's expensive. It's expensive, yes, we agree. Now we can have the more productive conversation about whether the value justifies the investment.
This technique is called the yes and of persuasion. You agree with whatever is genuinely agreeable, and then you build from that shared ground. It completely changes the dynamic of the conversation. Instead of a debate, you have a collaboration. Instead of two people on opposite sides of a table, you have two people sitting side by side, looking at the same problem together. The third principle is to distinguish between concerns and deal breakers. Not every objection is equal. Some concerns, when addressed, dissolve completely, and the person moves forward enthusiastically. Others are real constraints. The timing genuinely isn't right. The budget genuinely doesn't exist. The decision maker genuinely isn't in the room. And the most effective thing you can do with a real constraint is acknowledge it cleanly and either solve it or agree to return when the constraint changes. Trying to bulldoze through a genuine constraint, trying to pressure someone into a yes that genuinely isn't right for them right now, is both ineffective and damaging to the relationship. The person will feel pressured even if they eventually comply, and that feeling poisons the relationship. Whereas if you say, it sounds like this isn't the right moment, when would be a better time to revisit this? You leave the door completely open. You demonstrate respect for their reality, and you separate yourself from every other pushy person who has ever tried to override their genuine constraints. The fourth principle, reframe resistance as engagement. The people who push back hardest are often the ones who are most interested. Complete indifference looks like, no thank you, I'm not interested, and a turned back. Resistance looks like a debate. If someone is arguing with you, they're engaged, they're thinking about it, they care enough to push back, and that engagement is something you can work with. There's an old negotiation principle that says the person who cares less wins, and while I think that's a simplistic frame, it captures something real. When you're visibly desperate for a particular outcome, the other person has enormous power over you. But when you're genuinely comfortable with a no, when you're there to find out if there's a good fit, not to force one, your whole energy changes. You become calmer, more curious, less reactive,
And counterintuitively, that calm, non-desperate energy is far more persuasive than enthusiasm or pressure, because it signals confidence. It signals that you don't need this person's yes, which makes your yes much more attractive.
Emotional intelligence as a persuasion superpower. We've talked a lot about the psychology of persuasion from a somewhat technical angle, the drivers, the structure, the language. Now I want to go deeper into what I think is the actual master skill underneath all of it, emotional intelligence. Specifically, the ability to read, understand, and respond appropriately to the emotional reality of the people you're trying to influence. Because here's what separates truly exceptional persuaders from people who are just technically competent at the craft. Technically competent persuaders know the moves, they know the principles, they can execute the structure. But exceptional persuaders can read the room. They can sense when the energy shifts. They can tell when someone's words and their body language are contradicting each other. They know when to push forward and when to pull back. They know when a conversation needs to slow down and get personal, and when it needs to focus and get practical. These are skills of emotional intelligence, and they're developed not through learning more techniques, but through developing a more sensitive and accurate awareness of what's actually happening in the emotional landscape of any given interaction. The first component is self-awareness. You cannot read other people's emotional states accurately if you're not clear on your own. And this is harder than it sounds, because in high-stakes persuasion situations, when something really matters to you, when you really want or need a particular outcome, your own emotions are running hot. You might be anxious, you might be excited, you might be frustrated. And when these emotions are running without your awareness, they leak. They color your tone. They make you push when you should pull. They make you talk when you should listen. The practice of self-awareness in persuasion is about developing the habit of checking in with yourself in the middle of a conversation. What am I feeling right now? How is that affecting the way I'm showing up? Am I pushing too hard because I'm anxious? Am I going too fast because I'm excited? This kind of real-time self-monitoring is what allows you to make conscious adjustments rather than being driven by your emotions unconsciously. The second component is empathy, and I want to make a distinction here that I think is really important. There are two kinds of empathy. The first is emotional empathy, feeling what another person feels. The second is cognitive empathy, understanding what another person feels without necessarily feeling it yourself. For persuasion, cognitive empathy is actually more useful than emotional empathy. Emotional empathy, while beautiful and connecting, can overwhelm you if it's too strong. If you feel everyone's feelings at the same intensity they feel them, you become unable to function. Cognitive empathy, the ability to step into another person's perspective and understand how the world looks from where they're standing, is what allows you to craft responses that land. Developing cognitive empathy requires practice. It requires getting into the habit of asking yourself, before any significant persuasion situation, a set of perspective-taking questions. What is this person most worried about right now? What does success look like from their perspective? What pressures are they under that have nothing to do with me? What would I need to feel before I'd say yes in their situation? These questions don't always produce perfect answers, but they shift your mental frame from "how do I make my case" to "how do I understand their world?" And that shift alone makes you dramatically more effective.
The third component is emotional regulation, the ability to stay calm and grounded under pressure.
This might be the most practically impactful emotional intelligence skill in persuasion, because almost everything that goes wrong in persuasion conversations goes wrong because one or both parties loses emotional regulation. When you lose emotional regulation, when you get frustrated, defensive, anxious, or reactive, your capacity for strategic thinking drops dramatically. Your ability to listen accurately goes down. Your language becomes less precise. You start reacting rather than responding, and all the preparation you've done, all the skills you've developed become unavailable to you because your nervous system has shifted into a threat response mode that isn't compatible with nuanced communication. Learning to stay regulated under pressure is not about suppressing emotion. It's about having enough space between the stimulus and your response to choose how you respond. This is a skill, and like all skills, it's developed through practice. The practices that support emotional regulation, mindfulness, breath work, physical exercise, sleep, stress management are not soft lifestyle habits. They are hard performance requirements for anyone who wants to be consistently effective at high-stakes influence. The fourth component is reading nonverbal signals. A large proportion of what people communicate in conversation has nothing to do with the words they're saying. It's in their posture, their facial expressions, the pace and tone of their speech, the direction of their gaze, the way they're holding their body. And these signals are often more accurate than their words because they're harder to control consciously. Learning to read these signals isn't about pop psychology tricks. It's about paying careful attention to the difference between what someone is saying and how they're saying it, and to the difference between baseline behavior and behavior that changes when specific topics come up. When someone crosses their arms and leans back right after you mention price, that's information. When someone's voice gets flat and their eye contact decreases after they say, "That sounds great," that's information. And if you're paying attention, you can adjust your approach in real time based on what you're seeing. The most powerful version of this skill is what might be called emotional resonance, the ability to attune your energy to the person you're with. This is what great conversationalists do intuitively. They match the pace, the tone, the emotional register of the person they're with. When you're talking to someone who's stressed, you slow down, you get quieter, you let them vent. When you're talking to someone who's energized and enthusiastic, you match that energy. When someone is careful and methodical, you become precise and thorough. This attunement isn't about being chameleon-like or fake. It's about demonstrating that you're with them, not performing at them.
Persuasion in specific contexts. The principles we've covered apply universally, but they manifest differently depending on the context. Let's talk about some of the most common persuasion situations people face and how the principles apply specifically in each one. The first context is workplace persuasion, getting buy-in from colleagues, managers, and direct reports. This is one of the trickiest persuasion contexts because the power dynamics are complex and often shifting. You're not just trying to make a good case, you're navigating organizational politics, protecting relationships, managing your own reputation, and often working within constraints that have nothing to do with the quality of your idea. The most important thing to understand about workplace persuasion is that the decision to support your idea is almost never purely about the idea. It's also about how supporting your idea affects the other person's interests, reputation, and workload. A colleague who might otherwise love your idea won't support it if they think it will add to their already overwhelming workload. A manager who intellectually agrees with your proposal might not back it if they think it will put them at odds with someone they're trying to stay aligned with.
This means that before you pitch any idea internally, you need to do reconnaissance. Talk to the people who matter before the meeting where the decision gets made. Understand their concerns. Find out what they need from this project for it to feel like a win for them, and then adapt your proposal to address those concerns and incorporate their needs. When you walk into the room having already had those conversations, you walk in with allies rather than undecided jurors. The second specific context is negotiation. Negotiation is a persuasion context with its own specific dynamics, and one of the biggest mistakes people make in negotiation is treating it as a competition that someone has to lose. The zero-sum frame, in which whatever the other side gains, you lose, is almost always wrong. In most negotiations, there are multiple dimensions being negotiated simultaneously, and the parties place different values on different dimensions. This creates enormous opportunity for trades that make both sides better off than they would have been in a purely positional negotiation. The key to finding these opportunities is, again, discovery. You need to understand what the other side actually wants and why, not just what they're asking for, because often what they're asking for is a proxy for a deeper interest, and if you can find a way to serve that deeper interest without giving them everything they asked for, you've found an agreement that feels like a win for them without costing you what positional negotiation would have. One of the most powerful negotiation techniques is to ask why after any significant ask. You're asking for a 30% discount. Can you help me understand what's driving that? The answer will almost always reveal the underlying interest, which might be about budget constraints, about setting a precedent, about a comparison they're making to another vendor, or about something else entirely. And once you understand the underlying interest, you have far more options than you did when you were just looking at the stated position. The third context is persuasion in personal relationships with partners, family, and close friends. This is actually the most important context and often the most neglected in discussions of persuasion because people assume persuasion is a professional skill and relationships should just work naturally. But the most significant decisions of your life are made in the context of your closest relationships, and the quality of those decisions is enormously affected by your ability to communicate, listen, understand, and be understood.
The principles of persuasion in personal relationships are the same, but the emotional stakes are higher, which makes emotional regulation even more critical. The most common failure mode in relationship persuasion is the escalation cycle. One person feels unheard, they escalate their emotional intensity to try to get through. The other person escalates defensively, and the conversation spirals into conflict that's now much harder to resolve than the original issue. The circuit breaker for this cycle is doing something that feels completely counterintuitive in the heat of the moment. Fully acknowledging the other person's emotional experience before making any argument. Not agreeing with them, not capitulating, just demonstrating that you genuinely understand why they feel the way they feel. I understand why that felt unfair to you. From where you were sitting, it probably looked like I wasn't considering your perspective. That acknowledgement, when it's genuine, often dissolves more defensiveness in 10 seconds than 10 minutes of argument could. The fourth context is persuading groups or audiences. Whether it's a presentation, a speech, a pitch to a panel, or a town hall meeting, the challenge of persuading groups is that you can't customize your approach to each individual. You have to find the common emotional ground that resonates across diverse people with different perspectives. The most effective tool for group persuasion is narrative, not data, not argument, story.
A single, well-chosen story that illustrates your key point in human, specific, vivid terms will be more persuasive to a group than any amount of PowerPoint data. This is because stories create a shared experience. While you're telling the story, everyone in the room is having roughly the same emotional experience simultaneously, and that shared experience creates a form of group alignment that argument cannot. The second tool for group persuasion is the acknowledgement of the strongest version of the opposing view. Nothing builds credibility with a group faster than demonstrating that you understand the best arguments against your position, and then showing why you still hold your position despite those arguments. This shows intellectual honesty, it shows confidence, and it disarms the people in the room who were preparing to raise exactly those objections because you've already named them. They now feel understood rather than adversarial, which shifts their emotional orientation toward you.
The ethics of persuasion, where the line is. We can't have a real conversation about persuasion without talking about ethics, because the skills we've been discussing are powerful. They can be used to build trust, create genuine value, and help people make decisions that are good for them. And they can also be misused, and it's important to be honest about both. The line between persuasion and manipulation is real, and I think it can be clearly defined. Here it is. Persuasion serves the interests of both parties. Manipulation serves only the interests of the persuader at the expense of the person being influenced. More specifically, manipulation involves one or more of the following: deception, creating false beliefs about a product, situation, or self; exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities, targeting people's fears, insecurities, or cognitive biases in ways that override their rational judgment; undermining autonomy, using pressure, false urgency, or coercion to prevent someone from making a genuinely free choice; and pursuing outcomes that you know are not in the other person's best interest. Everything we've discussed in this episode can be done ethically or unethically. Deep listening can be genuine or performative. Framing can be honest or misleading. Social proof can be real or manufactured. Identity appeals can reflect genuine observation or calculated flattery. The technique itself is neutral. The intent and the accuracy of the representation are what determine whether it's persuasion or manipulation. Here's why I think ethics in persuasion is not just a moral consideration, but a practical one. Manipulation works in the short run and fails in the long run. When someone realizes they've been manipulated, and most people eventually do, the damage to the relationship is severe and often irreparable, and word travels. Reputation is built cumulatively over years of interactions. A reputation for honest, genuine, other interest-serving influence is an enormous long-term competitive advantage. A reputation for manipulation is a career and relationship killer. So even from a purely self-interested standpoint, honesty and genuine regard for the other person's interests is the optimal strategy. The highest and most sustainable form of influence is the kind that leaves people better off, more informed, more confident, more clear than they were before the conversation. When you consistently operate this way, you don't need to persuade people. They come to you. There's also a deeper point here about what kind of person you want to be and what kind of relationships you want to have. I genuinely believe that the techniques of persuasion, practiced with integrity and genuine care for others, make you not just more effective, but more fully human. They require you to slow down, to listen, to try to understand perspectives other than your own. They require empathy, patience, and humility. And in practicing these things, you become better,
not just at persuasion, but at relationships, at leadership, at life. The alternative, treating persuasion as a game of dominance, a contest to be won through psychological tricks, makes you worse as a human being and less effective over time as the people around you gradually realize what's happening and protect themselves from you. Nobody wants to be around someone who makes them feel like a target.
The inner game, becoming someone worth listening to. All right, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the psychology of decisions, the architecture of influential conversations, the language of influence, handling resistance, emotional intelligence, specific contexts, and ethics. Now I want to talk about something that doesn't get enough attention in any discussion of persuasion, the inner game. Who you are, not just what you do. Because here's the thing about all these techniques and frameworks. They are multipliers. They multiply whatever you already bring to the table. And if what you already bring to the table is genuine conviction, authentic care, and a real track record of delivering on your promises, then these techniques make you extraordinarily effective. But if what you're multiplying is emptiness, inauthenticity, or self-interest at the expense of others, then all the technique in the world just makes you more efficiently untrustworthy. So let's talk about the character attributes that make someone naturally, inherently persuasive, independent of any specific technique. The first one is conviction. People who believe deeply in what they're saying have a natural persuasive power that people without conviction can never fake. Conviction is felt. It lives in the pace of your speech, the steadiness of your eye contact, the ease with which you acknowledge weaknesses while still standing behind your overall position. When someone is genuinely convinced of something, their entire body communicates it, and that conviction is contagious. When you're in the presence of someone who really, truly believes in what they're saying, something in you starts to believe it too. Not because they've made a logical argument, but because their certainty is emotionally compelling. This means that one of the most important things you can do to become more persuasive is to only advocate for things you genuinely believe in. If you don't actually believe your product is the best solution for this particular customer, don't pitch it. If you don't actually believe in the strategy you're being asked to present, say so before you present it. The short-term discomfort of that honesty is worth infinitely more than the long-term cost of being someone who pitches things they don't believe in. The second character attribute is reliability. Do what you say you will do, every time. This sounds simple and unglamorous compared to the more exciting skills of rapport building or reframing, but over time, consistent reliability builds a depth of trust that no amount of social skill can replicate. The person who always follows through, who sends the email they said they'd send, who remembers the thing you mentioned in passing, who delivers ahead of deadline, is exercising a form of influence every single time. They are training everyone around them to trust their word. And trust, as we established at the beginning, is the foundation of all persuasion. The third is curiosity. Genuinely curious people are fascinating to be around, and they're naturally influential, not because they're trying to be, but because their curiosity creates a quality of attention and engagement that most people never experience. When a genuinely curious person is talking to you, they make you feel like the most interesting thing in the room, and people are enormously attracted to that feeling. They want to be around it. They want to say yes to people who make them feel that way. Developing genuine curiosity about other people is not as simple as it sounds if it's not currently your natural state. It requires a deliberate shift in orientation from seeing other people primarily as obstacles, resources, or audiences to seeing them as genuinely complex, interesting beings who have had experiences and developed perspectives that you haven't encountered. Once you develop that genuine interest, it doesn't need to be performed. It shows up automatically.
The fourth attribute is humility.
And by this, I don't mean false modesty or self-deprecation. I mean genuine epistemic humility, the honest acknowledgement that you don't know everything, that you might be wrong, that the other person's perspective might contain something valuable that you haven't considered. Paradoxically, humility is one of the most powerful credibility builders available. Because when you demonstrate that you're willing to change your mind in light of new information, you signal to the other person that your confidence on the things you're not willing to change about is grounded in actual certainty, not ego protection. The fifth attribute, and perhaps the most important, is genuine investment in other people's success. Not performative investment, not "I care about my clients" on a website. Real, behaviorally demonstrated investment in the outcomes of the people you work with and care for. This means thinking about people between your meetings with them. It means noticing opportunities that might be relevant to them and passing them along with no agenda. It means celebrating their wins, genuinely, without keeping score. It means making referrals that aren't good for you, but are good for them. This kind of investment, done consistently and without expectation of return, creates a level of loyalty and reciprocal goodwill that is essentially impossible to manufacture through technique alone. When you combine these character attributes, conviction, reliability, curiosity, humility, and genuine investment in others, with the technical skills we've discussed, you become someone who doesn't need to work very hard to persuade people, because people want to be persuaded by you. They trust you, they like you, they want to say yes to you. And your job becomes less about convincing and more about simply being clear about what you need.
Persuasion as a daily practice. How to keep getting better. One of the things that frustrates people about personal development material is that it gives you insights, but not a clear path to actually implementing them. You feel inspired, you understand the concepts, and then real life happens and you slip back into your old patterns within 48 hours. So let's talk very specifically about how to actually integrate what we've covered into your daily life. The first practice is the pre-conversation preparation habit. Before any significant persuasion situation, a meeting, a negotiation, a difficult conversation, a pitch, take 5 minutes to go through a set of preparation questions. What does this person most care about? What are they likely worried about in this conversation? What would a great outcome look like from their perspective? What's the most likely resistance I'll encounter, and what's the real concern underneath it? What question could I ask that would show genuine curiosity about their situation? 5 minutes, that's all it takes, and the difference between walking into a conversation having thought through these questions versus walking in unprepared is enormous. Not because you'll have a script, but because you'll have your attention pointed in the right direction. You'll be oriented toward them rather than toward yourself. The second practice is the post-conversation reflection habit. After any significant interaction, take a few minutes to debrief yourself. What worked well? What fell flat? When did I lose the thread? What was happening in that moment? Was there a point where I pushed too hard? Was there an objection I didn't fully address? What would I do differently if I had the conversation again? This kind of deliberate reflection is what separates people who improve from people who just get more experienced without getting better. Experience without reflection is just repeated behavior. Experience plus reflection is learning. And the people who get genuinely great at persuasion over time are the ones who reflect honestly and often. The third practice is to become a student of great communicators. Read broadly. Watch interviews, negotiations, great speeches, therapy sessions, not to copy anyone's style, but to expand your range of what's possible in human communication. Every truly skilled persuader has studied other skilled persuaders. They've borrowed techniques that resonated, tested them, adapted them to their own style, and discarded what didn't fit. This kind of intentional learning accelerates development enormously.
The fourth practice is to deliberately create low-stakes practice opportunities. The problem with waiting to practice persuasion in high-stakes situations is that the stakes are too high for experimentation. You need to be able to try things, fail, observe what happens, and try something different. You can do this in every conversation you have, with the barista who takes your order, with the colleague you pass in the hallway, with the checkout person at the grocery store. These interactions are practice grounds. Every conversation is an opportunity to practice genuinely listening, asking a follow-up question, acknowledging someone's perspective before stating yours. The people who get good at this fast are the ones who never waste an interaction.
The fifth practice is perhaps the most important, asking for feedback, directly, from people who will tell you the truth. Did that conversation feel balanced? Did I listen enough? Was there a point where you felt pushed? Most people never ask these questions because the answer might be uncomfortable. But the discomfort of honest feedback is nothing compared to the cost of continuing to make the same mistakes without knowing you're making them. Find one or two people in your life who will be genuinely honest with you about how you show up in conversation and pay attention to what they say. The sixth practice is studying your own resistance patterns. When do you find it hardest to persuade people? Is it when someone gets emotional and you don't know how to respond? Is it when you're under time pressure? Is it when you're pitching something you don't fully believe in? Is it when you feel like you need the outcome too much? These patterns are your development roadmap. The places where you consistently struggle are the places where your growth will have the most impact. The seventh practice is reading, voraciously, across disciplines. The best persuaders are often the best synthesizers. They can make connections between ideas from different domains. They can find the analogy from biology that perfectly illuminates a business problem. They can draw on history to put a current situation in perspective. They can use a story from their personal life to make a technical concept human. This breadth of reference is built through years of curious, eclectic reading, and it makes every conversation richer and more resonant.
Conclusion: the quiet power of being truly understood. Let's bring it all the way back to the beginning. We started by saying that persuasion has a bad reputation, that most people confuse it with manipulation, that when they hear the word, they picture a cheap tactic or a pressured close. And we said that real persuasion, the deep, lasting, relationship-building kind, is the exact opposite of that. It's the ability to connect so genuinely with another person's world that when you make a request or offer a perspective, it doesn't feel like a pitch, it feels like a gift. We covered the psychology of why people say yes, the need for autonomy, the hunger to feel understood, the power of identity, the social nature of our decision-making, and the emotional foundations of every human choice. We talked about the foundation of trust, how it's built slowly through consistent integrity, through honest acknowledgement of limitations, through genuine investment in other people's outcomes, and how that foundation is ultimately what makes all the other skills possible. We walked through the 5 phases of an influential conversation: connection, discovery, alignment, offer, and facilitation. And we saw how each phase builds the conditions for the next, and how the entire structure is designed not to push people toward yes, but to create an environment in which they arrive there themselves. We explored the language of influence, the difference between words that open and words that close, the power of questions, the irreplaceable persuasive force of genuine story, and the underrated wisdom of silence. We talked about resistance, how to welcome it, how to hear the real concern underneath the stated objection, how to address it honestly and thoroughly, and how to stay non-desperate and curious even when the stakes are high. We went deep into emotional intelligence, self-awareness, empathy, emotional regulation, and the ability to read the room and attune your energy to the person in front of you.
We looked at specific contexts, workplace persuasion, negotiation, personal relationships, and group communication, and saw how the same principles manifest differently depending on the dynamics of each setting. We drew the clear and important line between persuasion and manipulation and made the case that ethical persuasion is not just morally right, but practically superior over any time horizon that matters. And we talked about the inner game, the character attributes that make someone naturally persuasive regardless of technique, and the daily practices that build genuine mastery over time. Here's what I want to leave you with. All of this, every technique, every framework, every principle is in service of one thing: creating genuine connection between human beings. The most persuasive thing you can ever do is make another person feel truly seen and understood. Not flattered, not impressed, understood. And in that state of genuine understanding, they will trust you, they will like you, they will want to work with you and for you. They will say yes, not because you've overcome their resistance, but because their resistance dissolved when they realized you were genuinely on their side. That is the quiet power of real persuasion, not the power of pressure or tactics or clever framing, the power of genuine human connection, consistently expressed through careful listening, honest communication, and authentic care for others. And the beautiful thing about developing this skill is that it doesn't just make you more effective in negotiations or presentations or pitches. It makes you a better friend, a better partner, a better parent, a better leader. It makes every relationship in your life richer, deeper, and more real. Because in the end, all persuasion is just two people trying to understand each other well enough to find a path forward together. And there is no more fundamentally human work than that. So go practice it, not just in meetings, not just when there's something at stake. Practice it in the line at the coffee shop. Practice it with your spouse over dinner. Practice it with the person who disagrees with you online. Practice it especially with the people who frustrate you the most. Because those people, the ones who resist you, push back, misunderstand you, and exasperate you, they are your greatest teachers. Every conversation is a chance to understand someone a little better than you did before. Take it. Every time. Thank you for spending this time together. Now go move some people.